This is Constance from Beaumont, Texas, and you're listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. Creating a podcast isn't that simple. It's more than just recording yourself and uploading it. To really get your show to be everything you want it to be, you're gonna need a little more than that. You need easy, reliable hosting so your time can be spent creating your content, the most accurate download stats so you know if you're reaching the audience you're wanting to, and a web page that makes setting up totally easy on you and won't take up too much of your valuable time. And BLUBRRY offers all of this and more for hosts and aspiring hosts alike. Simple media hosting, a fully integrated WordPress website with their PowerPress sites. So if you already have a podcast or you've always dreamed about starting one, head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up, and the first month is on us. The BLUBRRY support team is available to walk you through the steps of migrating your show without losing any subscribers, or to help you get started in the process of launching your new show. With the first month for free, using promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses. So, let's get started. And like I do every week, I would like to take the time to thank everyone for continuing to support California Dreaming on social media by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as for those who have left reviews for the show on Apple Podcasts or whichever platforms you listen to the show on, by spreading the word and recommending California Dreaming in listening groups, and of course, for supporting us on Patreon as well. There are currently at least 20 bonus episodes on Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to most of those episodes as well. This week, I'd like to thank Nate B., Katie B., Jennifer W., and Shree Paul for joining Patreon this week, and a thank you to Lisa Beans for raising up her pledge to the next tier. And if you don't want to join Patreon but you would like to make a one-time donation to help support, you can do so through PayPal by using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Again, thank you for your support. So dreamers, I went out of town this last weekend, well, in the days leading up to the weekend, and I just got back yesterday and I scrambled really fast to finish up this episode, getting my notes ready to record. I've had at least 3 different stories that I've been trying to piece together over the last month or so. There are these cases with a lot of information, and it's just some of these things, the research can be overwhelming, and I needed a little bit more time to organize things properly. There are other stories that I want to tell that are a little more straightforward, and those can flow really smoothly when it comes to getting everything ready for Tuesday mornings. And the last few episodes have been like that for me. So when it comes down to the wire and I'm running out of time, and I don't think I'll have the episode that I have planned ready, I'll look through my notes and see what I can put together just to make sure we don't fall behind or miss a week. So what is it about certain cases that are easier to research than others? I guess when there's too little information or there's too much information, that makes things difficult both ways. There's like the sweet spot when you're looking stuff up and just the right articles pop up, and I just begin reading and the story starts to come together in my head. If there's too little information, that makes it hard to stretch into a decent length episode, and oftentimes I'll make those into bonuses or put them on Patreon. That happens with some older cases sometimes, ones that took place many, many years ago, where there just isn't much out there to be found. And then there's the conundrum of unsolved cases. I don't cover those very often, but when I do, it's because I'm interested in the different theories surrounding a mystery, or if there is a clear and present suspect, but nothing can be done about it. I find those to be really intriguing. And then, on occasion, we'll do a case about a missing person. Sometimes the theories can take you so deep into the woods, and that might be the case with this story that I wanted to share with you today. What we're going to talk about, it's a very strange tale, and it is technically a closed case, but there are lots of questions swirling around the whole thing, and it's left many feeling that it really isn't solved. I'm hoping to parse all of that out with you today in this 89th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of Ronni Chasen. Ronni Sue Chasen was actually born Veronica Cohen on October 17, 1946, in Kingston, New York. Her career as a publicist started off in 1973 when her brother, director Larry Cohen, hired her on as a publicist for 2 of his films. From there, Ronni would go on to become one of the top publicists in the film industry after she left New York for Hollywood in the 70s, and would enjoy working in public relations over the course of 4 decades. It was her job to get the word out about whatever film she was hired to work for. As a publicist, when it came to movies with Oscar potential, she had nearly perfected her ways of boosting their chances of actually winning. There are lots of rules set in place by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences that do not allow their members to be lobbied by anyone. So a movie publicist needs to be savvy and innovative, and Ronni was all of this and more. She was a spokesperson, the face that was out there promoting films for some of the most prominent filmmakers in Hollywood. She was strategic and very much sought after for anyone looking for an Oscar nod and hopefully an Oscar win. She was described as someone who would take the reins and handle every single detail when it came to promoting a film. When the stars of the films were preparing to make their media, talk show, and red carpet rounds, it would be Ronni who got them ready. She prepped them for their interviews. She told them everything they needed to do as they made their way down the red carpet. And every journalist in the business knew exactly who Ronni Chasen was. For example, when John Travolta became famous in his breakout role on Welcome Back, Kotter, it was Ronni who coached him on how to give his first interviews. If the media needed some inside info about any actor or film, they'd seek her out. And on the flip side of that, if she wanted to get something out there in the media, she would seek them out, whether they were looking for a scoop or not. And they would listen. Like I said, Ronni began working in the field with her brother, who started off writing and directing B-movies and horror films. She then went to work for Warren Cohen, considered to be a PR mastermind, and even spent some time in charge of publicity for MGM Studios. But what Ronni eventually became known for was the magic touch that she seemed to have when it came to working with members of the Academy as they made their decisions as to who would be taking home the Oscars each year. Some of Ronni's achievements included Oscar wins for On Golden Pond, Driving Miss Daisy, The Hurt Locker, Slumdog Millionaire, and No Country for Old Men. She was responsible for the Oscar campaigns of more than 100 films. She is also credited for getting the Academy to see the musical composers of films to be just as big of stars as the actors and actresses in the films. And she is responsible for the publicity buzz that led to Hans Zimmer nabbing an Oscar nod for his original score in Driving Miss Daisy. She would go on to begin her own PR firm called Chasen and Company, and once Hans got that nomination for his music, movie composers flocked to Ronni's firm. So how did she manage to sway the vote of the members of the Academy? Well, it truly was one of her best-kept secrets. But even if she did divulge her ways, it would still take that special kind of someone to execute it. She knew the Academy rules like the back of her hand, and she got to know each member of the Academy intimately. She knew what they liked, how they thought, what drew them in, and what didn't. You see, the Academy is comprised of people born of the baby boom era and even earlier. And Ronni was too. And she connected with them because she was them. She also exuded the kind of charm that just enamored people. And not to mention having a keen intuition and awareness, her unwavering persistence, determination, and tenacity, and a deep passion for movies. Not to mention she was well versed at hobnobbing and rubbing elbows, engaging others in endless banter. And the woman loved to throw a cocktail party. All of this was Ronni Chasen, the perfect ingredients for a powerhouse of a publicist. And she went about it old school. She knew how to create a buzz just about anything. So, on November 16th, 2010, at close to 12:30 in the morning, when Ronni Chasen was shot and killed as she was driving home from the premiere of the movie Burlesque, the news sent shockwaves through the film industry. Residents of Beverly Hills who resided near the intersections of Whittier Drive and Sunset Boulevard began calling 911 to report the sounds of gunshots in close proximity to their homes. A few minutes later, another barrage of 911 calls began coming into dispatch to report a newer model black Mercedes-Benz had jumped a curb, crashed into a concrete street lamp, and caused it to fall over. After Ronni had been shot, she continued to drift in her vehicle for approximately a quarter mile or just under half a kilometer before crashing into and toppling that concrete light post. As first responders arrived, the scene was chilling. The details of it were meticulously chronicled. White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane was playing on the radio. The engine was still running, hazard lights flashing. And incidentally, if you hearken back to the episode entitled The Life and Death of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel that I covered with Justin over at Mysterious Circumstances and all of his other podcasts that he does, Bugsy's murder took place 350 yards, 321 meters, a 1-mile bike ride, or a 4-minute walk away from where Ronni was shot and killed, which, to this day, remains the Beverly Hills Police Department's most notorious unsolved case. So the first responders to arrive happened upon a disturbing and violent scene. Ronni was seated in the driver's seat of her car, but she was slumped over. The airbag in her steering wheel had deployed, and the passenger side window was shattered, and Ronni was bleeding from her chest and nose. And though she was still barely technically alive, the breathing was sounding more like gurgling noises. She was barely conscious, if at all. Upon closer inspection of Ronni at the scene, as she was being prepared by paramedics to transport to the hospital, it became clear that she had been shot multiple times in the chest. She was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but Ronni was mortally wounded. She was pronounced dead about 45 minutes after being shot, at the age of 64. Ronni had been married only a short time, which ended in divorce, and she had no children. Incidentally, her brother, who we mentioned a few minutes ago, Larry Cohen, he just passed away this year in March at the age of 82. An autopsy was performed the following day on November 17th. It revealed that Ronni had been shot 4 times, 3 times in the chest, once in the back. And the following information comes directly from her autopsy report, and I am uncertain if it was able to determine which order the gunshots were in, but this is the order in which they were examined. Gunshot wound number 1 was to the upper back and a few inches slightly to the right of her spine. It entered her body in a right to left direction, slightly back to front and slightly pointed downward, that passed through her left scapula, shoulder, and left arm where it became embedded. This wound was not considered rapidly fatal, and there was no soot or stippling around the wound, indicating the gun was not fired in close proximity to her. The bullet recovered from her body was medium caliber and copper jacketed, and they were hollow point. Gunshot wound number 2 entered through her right shoulder, passed through her right arm, shattering her right humerus and exited out the left side of her upper back, and this was considered to be a fatal wound. It traveled from right to left, slightly front to back, and slightly downward, and again there was no evidence of soot or stippling on her body. Gunshot wound number 3 was to the chest and right shoulder, and it traveled from left to right and downward. This one would have been rapidly fatal as it went through her heart and lung before it became embedded. There was also no soot or stippling associated with this gunshot wound. And the 4th gunshot was also to the right side of her chest, though this one would not have been rapidly fatal as it missed all of her major organs, as it penetrated muscle and did not enter into her chest cavity. This bullet path entered, exited, re-entered, and re-exited her body. The attempts to save Ronni's life involved trying to surgically repair the damage to her heart, but it was to no avail. Since January 1st of 2000, the city of Beverly Hills has only seen 14 murders happen within its city limits. Ronni's murder would be the 3rd and final murder that took place in Beverly Hills in 2010, and by far was the most high profile. So, the Beverly Hills Police Department, and I may refer to them as the BHPD, is not very busy when it comes to homicide investigations. The initial report to the media indicated that Ronni had suffered 4 gunshot wounds, which led to her losing control of her vehicle as she was turning off of Sunset Boulevard and on to Whittier Drive. The Beverly Hills Police Department believed that the person who shot Ronni was a very skilled marksman and believed the killer was most likely driving a higher profile vehicle such as an SUV or a truck that it pulled up next to her as she waited to make that turn and opened fire. This would explain the downward trajectory of the bullets as they entered Ronni's body. The motive for the killing was believed to be robbery, but nothing was taken. Ronni's Prada purse was still next to her in plain view, right there in the passenger seat. On Saturday, November 27th, 2010, a resident of the Harvey apartment complex in East Hollywood named Robin Lyle unexpectedly received a knock at his door. Now, the Daily Beast, in reporting on this story, described these apartments as seedy, but I looked it up on Yelp to see exactly what specifically that may have meant. There were only 3 reviews, and one of them was from a gentleman whose application to the place was denied because of spotty credit, and he apparently had told them before paying the application fee that his credit was shaky, but they took his money order for the application fee, they cashed it, and he was denied. So he was disgruntled, but he never did live there. And the other 2 Yelp reviews were complete polar opposites of each other. I'll read you the 5-star review first. She said, "Honestly, for the price, you can't beat it. The units aren't large, but the location makes up for it. Walking distance to all the cool stuff in Hollywood. The neighbors are friendly, and the best thing about this place is the manager. She is the reason I would stay. Always takes care of everything I need." Now that was a completely different experience from the 1-star reviewer who said, "I'm embarrassed to say that I used to live here. This was my first place when I moved to LA. And dreamers, these were her words, and I'm sorry because it's super offensive. Aside from the transsexual crack whores and all the cholos, the building was infested with roaches. The carpet was disgusting, even with a rug doctor. But the worst was the fact that my upstairs neighbor's bathtub was leaking into my tub. Not only that, but the leak was causing the ceiling in my place to cave in. I packed up my stuff and moved into my car." Okay, so take that whichever way you will. I mean, If you're looking for a good location that's in close proximity to all the cool Hollywood hotspots, friendly neighbors, and a rad manager, then one may overlook the unsavory individuals, the roaches, the nasty carpets, the leaky tubs, and the caved-in ceilings. But anyways, based on the facts that emerge from the story, my guess is that the Harvey apartments of East Hollywood probably aren't that great. So back to the story. Rob and Lyle received that knock at the door. When he answered it, it was a former neighbor of the apartments, Harold Martin Smith. Harold was being evicted from the apartments and he was preparing to leave, and he had stopped by to say goodbye and God bless. He was leaving LA, heading up north, he said, being somewhat vague. Harold was a friendly man, but he did seem to have something more going on with him, most likely some mental health issues. He had difficulties, it seemed, on focusing. He blinked frequently and hard, and when he walked, he didn't pick up his feet, dragging the bottom of his shoes as he went along. He told Robin, "I just wanted to say goodbye. It was good being your neighbor." But as it were, Harold would never leave the Southern California area. On Wednesday, December 1st, 2010, 15 days after Ronni Chasen's murder, Harold Smith committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Why would he do something like that if he seemed to have plans to move on from the area up north, as he was said to have been planning? Well, the 43-year-old had lived a troubled life up to that point. Most of his adult life he found himself in and out of trouble with the law. He had quite an extensive criminal career, including at least one stint in prison on a robbery conviction. And somehow his name came up in the investigation into the high-profile shooting death of Ronni Chasen. Just as investigators were arriving at the Harvey apartments, the last known place that he had been staying, to ask him some questions about his possible involvement in her murder, he took his own life. Right there, on the spot, in front of the Beverly Hills police officers. The media attention on this case was already ramped up, but it amplified tenfold as the news of Harold Smith's suicide was being reported. Investigators had identified him as a person of interest in Ronnie's murder. But as the media began taking a good hard look at both of these cases and how it was Ronni Chasen, famed Hollywood publicist, and Harold Smith, the homeless career criminal, how it was that these two people's lives had apparently become intertwined on the evening of November 16th, 2010, on that Beverly Hills street corner. And the amounts of information regarding the case coming from the Beverly Hills Police Department was so minimal, it only fueled all the speculation and conjecture that began swirling around the case. And the more everyone began looking at it, the more it was being picked apart in the media and by the public. And it began to look as though Harold may not have been the person to have committed this crime. According to an article in the Daily Beast, they were told by two confidential law enforcement sources connected to the official investigation that the gun Harold used to kill himself was not a ballistics match to the gun used to kill Ronni. And this is what the Beverly Hills Police Department was telling the media in the days following Harold Smith's suicide. And around the same time as the speculation and theories about Harold were being floated, other news outlets began reporting that other sources close to the investigation indicated that police were looking at Ronnie's murder as having been committed by a hired hitman, and even went so far as to say that police had a pretty good idea of who it was put out the hit and hired the gunman, and that the person they were investigating as being this alleged hitman was in fact Harold Smith. And these sources also revealed that even though Harold took his own life before they could bring him into custody for questioning, The investigation was still ongoing and they were still making progress. And these same sources also revealed that police were entertaining the theory that the motive behind the hit was related to a business deal that had soured. In the days following Harold's suicide, police indicated that their investigation into him did not end with his death. They said that they had been surveilling him after they received information that Harold Smith had possibly been involved in Ronnie's death. And this information came to them from a tip reported by a viewer of America's Most Wanted when a segment on Ronnie's death was aired. However, another source contradicted this report that Harold was being investigated for an alleged connection to Ronnie's death. But rather, the reason why Harold had committed suicide was because he was under the impression that the police had shown up at his place of residence because there had been a slew of burglaries in the neighborhood, and he was afraid they were there to confront him and accuse him. 2 days after Harold took his own life, all the Beverly Hills Police Department was saying to the press was, at this time, it is unknown if Harold Smith was involved in the Chasen homicide. So when taking a closer look at Ronnie's death and Harold's possible involvement, looking at what the investigators had to work with early on in the investigation, I have to ask, does this make sense? Do the pieces fit? Who was Harold Smith and why was he named a person of interest in the shooting of Ronni Chasen? Well, the sad truth was at the time, the information as to who Harold was and what he was about was limited to his criminal record and whatever his neighbors potentially had to say about him when asked by reporters and journalists. The portrait of Harold Smith that began to emerge was indeed a troubling one, as I had alluded to earlier. He was a career criminal. He was being evicted. There was the potential that he had found himself in a state of desperation. With very little resources, no means of supporting himself, and soon no place to live, he may have even struck some as having been somewhat unstable, but he did not strike anybody who knew him to be the type of person who would have carried out a crime like the one he had been named a person of interest in. A very calculated murder, executed with the kind of accuracy and precision of a very well-practiced killer. A shooter with experience, a steady hand, a professional, and all of these, Harold was not. Yes, Harold Smith had an extensive criminal history spanning at least a quarter century by the time he died. And yes, the majority of his criminal activity involved robberies. But never in any case had he been arrested for doing anything as violent as what happened to Ronni Chasen. In one of Harold's last known robberies that he was tried for, the person he robbed testified that he grabbed her from behind and in what she described as being like a bear hug. He told her to hand over her purse, but she fought back and screamed, and this resulted in her having a broken jaw. And Harold ran away, only making off with her music player. And according to his neighbors at the Harvey Apartments, Harold was described as being generally pleasant, a laid-back person. They knew he had gone to jail on more than one occasion, but they never really knew what he had been arrested for. And in an apartment complex where drug use amongst its residents was prevalent, this did not seem to be the case when it came to Harold. With all of the illegal activity that was known to go on in and around the complex, which included drug dealing and sex work, all Harold was ever known for coming home to was a tall can of beer. That was his routine. But some of his neighbors did report some concerning things about Harold Smith. He was known to speak unintelligibly to himself, and as far as anybody knew, he had no identifiable source of income. It was not uncommon for him to ask his neighbors for food, toiletries, or other household supplies. And it was a known fact that Harold had fallen behind on paying his rent. But he always told people that he was expecting a windfall. What sort of windfall? Well, there was one person who seemed to be making a regular appearance in the media with a story to tell about this. A neighbor at the Harvey Apartments named Terry Gilpin. She was talking to all the major news outlets in the days following Harold's suicide, and according to her, she heard him tell her husband that he was anticipating a $10,000 payout for Ronni Chasen's death. Could this have been the windfall Harold was talking about? Not so fast. Nobody else at the Harvey apartment complex ever heard Harold mention anything about having anything to do with Ronni Chasen or any potential money to be paid to him for killing her. And as far as the source of this information, Terry Gilpin, she was a busybody, gossipy neighbor who is not to be relied upon for anything trustworthy. So, if Harold Smith wasn't a paid hitman with marksman-like shooting skills, then what exactly was the windfall? Well, the neighbor he had gone to visit to say goodbye to, Robin Lyle, he did speak to Harold about money. He was expecting a payout, but it involved a lawsuit he had filed against a former employer for wrongful termination, and Harold did indeed receive a settlement as a result of his lawsuit, but it wasn't as much as he had been hoping for or expecting. But he did receive it. Could Harold have been getting ready to try to start over again someplace up north, like he said, with the money that he did receive? Perhaps. But more details began to emerge from his criminal past that led to the other potential theories. Harold's neighbors described him as terrified at the prospect of potentially going back to jail. The Associated Press reported that Harold had been sentenced to 11 years in prison for a robbery that took place in none other than Beverly Hills. He was released after serving 9 years in 2007, and this conviction marked the second felony strike on his criminal record. In California, with the 3 strikes law in effect, if Harold were ever convicted again for any kind of felony, no matter how big or small, as long as it was a felony, he would be sentenced to 25 years to life in accordance with the 3 strikes law as it was written. So he was jumpy. He was on edge. He was anxious. Constantly. He was afraid of cops, and he was afraid to go back to jail. And whenever he came home to the apartments, he'd ask his neighbors if the cops had been there at all. And even the neighbors who weren't so keen on Harold Smith would not believe for a second that he had anything to do with Ronni Chasen's death. A resident named Sammy told reporters that Harold was nutty, and he was the kind of guy who would just stand around outside the bar for hours on end. He just got a bad feeling from the guy, but murdering Hollywood publicist Ronni Chasen? Not a chance. Not Harold. The cops are barking up the wrong tree here. When we step back and look at the details of Ronni Chasen's killing, that information in and of itself, to me, simply doesn't fit with the crime having been committed by someone in a situation as the one Harold Smith had found himself in recent years. He had no real solid place to call home. He was essentially about to become homeless. He had just been out of jail for 3 years at the time of Ronnie's killing, and it just did not seem as though Harold would be in the area where she was killed, much less having pulled off that kind of murder. The person who shot Ronni would have been very steady, methodical, and skillful when it came to firing a gun. Harold just doesn't quite fit the bill. If we were to put that gun into Harold's hand, naming him as being the man to have done this to Ronni, it was more likely that the shooting would have been sloppier, lacking the precision of a marksman. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that Harold was a convicted felon, Convicted of robbery, no less. Convicted of a robbery that took place in Beverly Hills to boot. And then there was the report by a nosy neighbor, Terry Gilpin, that Harold was talking about having been involved in Ronnie's death and that he was expecting a $10,000 payout for her killing. What if she did hear this? What if it was true? This could lend credence to the possibility Harold did indeed have a hand in her death. Yeah, maybe. Maybe not. We've heard of people like this making these kind of confessionals to others as a way of bragging about having something to do with the high-profile case, but not really being involved at all. It was just all talk. For whatever reason, the person confessing wanting to inject themselves into the case. This isn't unheard of. And couple that with the fact that this happened to be a pretty big, high-profile Hollywood killing, this could be somebody's 15 minutes of fame. When you've got the internet and entertainment news outlets like TMZ, if somebody insinuated they had something to do with a killing like this, the news would spread like wildfire. And for somebody like Harold, it would bring about the kinds of media attention he would otherwise never see in his lifetime. But the same could be said for good old Terry Gilpin, too. When you've got cameras and microphones from all the major news networks pointed at your face, could she have been simply embellishing her story for her 15 minutes? Yeah, it's very possible. Maybe she too heard Harold talking about receiving a windfall of money. Maybe he even put an amount of $10,000 out there in the conversation. He could have said it was from a job he had. Maybe he didn't get specific. Maybe he didn't say it was from a lawsuit. It might also be worth mentioning that the tip called in to America's Most Wanted, this tipster wanted to remain anonymous, but it was said that Harold Smith was bragging to neighbors in his apartment complex that he was paid $10,000 for killing Ronni Chasen. And if Harold would be arrested and convicted, the tipster would be eligible to collect the $125,000 reward that had been collected for information leading to her killer's arrest. So there's that. $125,000 is a lot of money for someone living in a rundown apartment in a less than desirable part of Hollywood. Heck, it's a lot of money for all of us. Incidentally, $100,000 was eventually paid to the America's Most Wanted tipster, and it wasn't Terry Gilpin, but it was somebody in the apartment complex, and I will come back to this a little bit later. So once police came around the Harvey apartment complex based on that tip from America's Most Wanted, a tip that pointed the finger at Harold Smith as being the person of interest in the case, it was very likely that someone at the apartment overheard Terry Gilpin telling the media what she had supposedly overheard Harold telling her husband, and this tipster took the conversation regarding a windfall from a lawsuit being something much more nefarious, like, say, for instance, a payout for a hit on a big-time Hollywood publicist. Then this theory was formulated and shared with the media, and of course they ran with it. Besides, Harold was known to be extremely paranoid and struggling with mental health issues, so it's hard to determine what to make of what he may or may not have said and how much validity to give it. If he was struggling with mental health problems, it is possible for him to have wanted to associate himself with something like Ronnie's death for the attention, even if it wasn't good attention, but sometimes any attention will do. But if we take into consideration the reports that Harold was extremely paranoid and fearful of going back to prison, then it wouldn't make any sense for him to want to associate himself with anything that would certainly send him back to prison for life, perhaps even worse. So, let's talk about the gun for a moment. In the days following Harold's suicide, the Beverly Hills Police Department reported to the media that the gun that he used to kill himself did not match the ballistics from the gun that was used to shoot Ronni Chasen. But 1 week after Harold's death, the Beverly Hills Police Department reported that based on their preliminary investigation into Ronnie's death, that they had reached the conclusion that her murder was in fact a random act committed during an attempted robbery that went bad. And at this point, the Beverly Hills PD also declared that the gun Harold used to kill himself was the same gun used to kill Ronni Chasen. According to their theory, Harold Smith was riding his bike when he shot and killed Ronnie. Harold's neighbors confirmed his main form of transportation was a beach cruiser, but later in police photos, his bike was shown to be a mountain bike. Also, at this press conference held by the BHPD, they brushed aside the theory that the shooting was indicative of having been committed by a trained professional hitman. Rather, they said, this murder appeared to be more likely an act of desperation committed by a lone assailant, further dismissing the reports that were leaked from the coroner's office that the bullet patterns that riddled Ronnie's body would have been fired by someone with a great deal of expertise with a firearm as wholly inaccurate, though the investigation up to that point was still incomplete and ongoing. So that's the narrative the Beverly Hills Police Department had in regards to Ronni Chasen's murder. But so many questions continue to be left unanswered. The first being this: what was Harold doing all the way over in the west side of Beverly Hills? He lived on the east side of Hollywood. Based on the address of the apartment complex at which he resided and the address of the corner where Ronnie was shot, I looked it up on maps and the distance was 7.6 miles or 12.23 kilometers, which by bicycle is about a 45-minute ride. It's not exactly far, but we'd also have to believe that he made that ride all the way across Hollywood, West Hollywood, and most of Beverly Hills on his mountain bike, with a gun, encountered Ronni Chasen near the intersection of Sunset and Whittier, shot her 4 times, and made his way back all the way home. How did Harold, who was essentially described as being a transient, who could have very easily been recognized as being as such based on his appearance and clothing, how did he manage to ride around on his bike in Beverly Hills and not be noticed by anyone, even the Beverly Hills Police Department, who have been known to be quite vigilant when it comes to anyone suspicious in their city? How did Harold, on his supposed bike ride through Beverly Hills, manage to do so without being captured on exactly 0 surveillance cameras anywhere along the 7-mile or 12-kilometer ride there? And we know when police arrived, they did so in full force at the reports of gunfire. I would really have to go out to Beverly Hills to get a look at the intersection myself, but in the few times that I've driven that stretch of Sunset Boulevard that passes through the city, the streets are very wide and clear. Most of the houses are set some distance from the streets, with many tall fences, trees, and shrubs. Many of the homes you can't even see from the street, and there's basically nothing along that stretch of the drive with the exception of sidewalks. There are also very few vehicles that are parked along these streets. And at night, traffic is not that heavy once you leave West Hollywood. So for Ronni Chasen to have been shot and killed in front of exactly 0 eyewitnesses kind of makes sense. Nobody's really going to be around at that time of night, and nobody who lives nearby is going to really be able to have a clear view of the street. So consider that scene for a moment. Ronnie was shot. Calls from residents to 911 start coming in immediately. Police arrived at enough time to continue to hear noises coming from Ronnie, which means she was likely taking her last breaths. The coroner said at least one of her gunshot wounds, the one that went through her heart, would have been rapidly fatal. How long does it take for someone shot through the heart to actually die? Well, technically, it was likely that Ronnie was going to go brain dead once she was shot through the heart because of the lack of blood flow carrying oxygen to the brain. That could be about a minute or 2, right? The brain can survive up to about 6 minutes without oxygen, but brain damage does begin very quickly, within a minute. And I'm no doctor, but clinical death, when the heart stops beating and the victim stops breathing, it varies. So for police to have arrived to hear Ronnie still making sounds leads me to believe that they got there really fast. So not much time had elapsed between her having been shot and first responders arriving at the scene. And what all of this leads me to ask is this: if Harold was on a bike and police got to the scene so fast, how was it he managed to ride away without anyone seeing him? Because wouldn't the cops be looking for a gunman too when responding to shots fired? I am not a cop either, but I think I would find it very difficult for Harold on a bike to be able to evade anything and everyone that could have or would have caught him in and around the scene of the shooting. He doesn't strike me as that savvy or that stealthy. Then let's consider the shooting itself. If Ronnie was driving her car and Harold is riding his bike, how is it he managed to expertly pump 4 bullets into her chest and back with such precision? She's in a moving car. He's on a moving bike. How is this scene supposed to have unfolded? They could have been at a standstill, but what are the chances of that? If Harold Smith had approached Ronnie's vehicle while on his bike, would she have stopped or stayed stopped to engage with him? This random guy on a bike in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country? Even when former detective Gil Carrillo, one of the investigators credited with being an integral part of the investigation into the Night Stalker of the 1980s, Richard Ramirez, when he was participating in an interview in the weeks following Ronni Chasen's murder, he was asked about the shots that killed Ronni Chasen, and he said that for her to have been shot with such accuracy in a moving vehicle, the shooting had to have been carried out by nothing less than an expert. He even went so far to say shooting with that level of precision would have been difficult even if the car wasn't moving. And no, there is nothing in Harold Smith's background to indicate that he was an expert marksman or a sharpshooter. Then I have questions about this gun that was not the gun and then suddenly it was the gun. The first reports that came out to the media following Harold's suicide was that the gun did not match the weapon used to kill Ronnie. Okay, but then a couple of days later, the Beverly Hills Police were like, oh yeah, my bad, that was the gun. Whoops. What the heck? Why the sudden change? I can't think of any case ever that a weapon was uncovered and it was rushed over to the lab for ballistics testing. The gun was fired, the bullet is examined under the microscope by the forensic ballistics expert alongside the bullets recovered from the crime scene, and either it was a match or it wasn't. I even remember seeing a case where a suspect took some sort of tool and shoved it down into the barrel of his gun in order to cause some scratches and irregularities in the barrel in order to throw off ballistics testing. And those experts were even able to sort through that manipulation of evidence as well. These women and men who are ballistics experts know what they are doing. We've seen it many times over in shows that we've watched through the years that talk about this sort of stuff. So, what's up with the Beverly Hills Police Department and whoever it was that did their ballistics examination? First, this wasn't the gun, and then it was? I'd really like to know the answer to that because nobody has ever really explained it. And I will expand on this too a little bit later. Also, I don't know all that much about ammunition. My knowledge is limited pretty much to the cases that we've covered, and I briefly touched on the type of ammunition that was used: copper jacketed hollow point bullets. I'm pretty sure someone listening, if you want to comment about this once you've listened, please do, and enlighten us that don't know too much about who is likely to have this type of ammo or who isn't, because the report that I read on the case said that if the bullets used to kill Ronnie were indeed hollow point bullets, it would be odd for someone like Harold Smith, a homeless guy with very little means, to be in possession of this type of ammunition. Though I do know the purpose of hollow point bullets and the potential for those to cause more damage, but I don't know the likelihood of Harold Smith being in possession of this type of ammunition. So the Beverly Hills Police Department would continue to investigate Ronnie's murder for another 7 months. Then, on Friday, July 15th, 2011, almost 8 months after Ronnie's death, the BHPD announced that its investigation into the killing was finished. Their statement read as follows. The Beverly Hills Police Department had completed the exhaustive investigation into the horrific murder of Ronni Chasen. During the investigation, detectives reviewed in excess of 150,000 emails and text messages belonging to the victim and investigated thousands of tips received on the police department's hotline. Beverly Hills police personnel assigned to this case worked in excess of 10,000 hours in order to thoroughly investigate each and every tip, theory, and legitimate lead in order to bring this investigation to conclusion. Without a doubt, it is the conclusion of robbery homicide detectives that the sole perpetrator of this most heinous crime was Harold Martin Smith. All facts and evidence conclusively indicate that Mr. Smith acted alone and was in possession of the murder weapon when confronted in Hollywood for questioning on the night of December 1st, 2010. The victim's family has asked that the media respect their privacy at this difficult time. And with that, the Beverly Hills Police Department considered the murder of Ronni Chasen case closed. But dreamers, nobody who ever takes a look at this case is so quick to accept that the murder of Ronni Chasen is solved and closed. For many, myself included, it remains shrouded in mystery. On Ronnie's last night alive, she had attended an after-party at the W Hotel in West Hollywood to celebrate the premiere of the film Burlesque, starring Cher and Christina Aguilera. For the film, Ronnie had been enlisted to represent the movie's producer, Donald DeLine, the lighting designer, Peggy Eisenhower, and songwriter, Diane Warren. Of the night, Diane Warren stated in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, "It was just the funnest night." Donald DeLine added, "She was being her usual mother hen self. It was so not out of the ordinary, just like 100 other nights, and she was loving it." This was a very important night. The Golden Globe ballots were about to be sent out in just 2 weeks. Ronnie was working her magic, making the rounds, commanding the room, making everyone listen to what she had to say about her clients, making sure the people she cornered knew what was what and who was who. But once Ronnie left the after party, the events that took place as she headed home in her black Mercedes-Benz, other than the fact that she was shot 4 times in the chest and in the back on a street where homes cost upwards of $10 to $25 million a pop, that she glided a quarter of a mile down the street until she took down a cement lamppost, is still unknown. At least, that's how many people who examine this case feel. Dark rumors began to swirl as to a potential motive. People were wondering who could have done this and why. To anyone who knew Ronnie, one thing was certain. She had not an enemy in the world that they knew of. Could she have accumulated some gambling debts? Was this some sort of high-end art deal gone awry? Or did it have anything to do with her work in the film industry? Did she piss somebody off? Did she cost someone a prestigious award nomination or fail to garner one? Could this have been a drive-by committed by a random stranger? Someone Ronnie had cut off and the thing turned into an act of road rage? Could this have been a crime of passion, a jilted lover? Someone Ronnie had slighted or brushed aside? And the biggest questions remained, could this have been a contract hit? It had all the makings of it with the exception of one thing, the victim. Of all the Hollywood characters, shady or otherwise, that Ronni may have crossed paths with, she was the least likeliest to have been targeted in a murder-for-hire plot. But apparently the Beverly Hills Police Department knew what happened. They did their investigation. They crossed their T's and dotted their I's. This was the handiwork of troubled transient and career criminal Harold Smith. He was desperate that night. He made his way down to Beverly Hills on his bike with the intentions of robbing someone. And along comes unsuspecting Ronni. He singles her out, an obviously wealthy older woman driving alone. Perfect. He approaches on his bike. He puts 4 bullets square into her torso without taking a thing. Then he vanishes into thin air, having gone completely undetected by everyone, the police, the public, and all surveillance cameras in the more than 14-mile or 22.5-kilometer round trip. Harold Smith acted alone, and in his final moments of desperation, not wanting to be made to face the consequences of his actions, he took his own life as police were closing in. And Harold's suicide in and of itself lends to the thought that he is guilty as charged. He took his own life because he knew what he had done, he was caught, and his life was over. I mean, why would an innocent man commit suicide, right? Well, based on what I've told you up to this point about Harold, there were lots of pre-existing factors that could have led the man wanting to kill himself. He is thought to have struggled with mental illness. He was described as paranoid and easily agitated. He was known to mumble to himself, and though he was not known to abuse drugs or alcohol, that is only based on neighbor speculation, and if he ever had a history of abusing substances, that too could have long-term effects on his overall state of mind. I found a link to Harold's autopsy, but it would not load on any of my devices, so I was unable to see his toxicology report. He had spent a significant amount of time in jail from 1998 to 2007 and was described as incredibly fearful of ever having to go back, potentially as a candidate for the 3 strikes law. Would a man with that hanging over his head take the risk of riding his bike all the way to Beverly Hills to rob somebody at 12:30 in the morning? And on top of that, commit the killing with the shooting skills of a professional hitman? All the while never so much as raising an eyebrow as he rode his bike through the posh streets of Beverly Hills? I suppose stranger things have happened, right? Yeah, no, lots of people really aren't buying this. And they really weren't believing the Beverly Hills Police Department was being forthcoming with the whole truth, despite the department's insistence that this was the conclusion their investigation came to in the end, and it was the right one. There is no evidence, at least none that the Beverly Hills Police Department has pointed to, that definitively placed Harold Smith at the scene of the murder, because I'm certain if they had any, they'd have shared that information in order to ease skeptical minds. There was no indication that robbery was a motive in the case, as Ronnie's brown Prada bag was in plain sight on the passenger seat next to her, untouched. And I will post some of the crime scene photos. They are very sharp and very clear. When the BHPD revealed that Harold Smith acted alone, they had no proof of that being fact either, other than the theory that Harold traveled to Beverly Hills on his bike, which would of course mean he was obviously alone. All the Beverly Hills Police Department had to tell the public was this African-American man, Harold Martin Smith, who had 1 prior arrest on his record for a robbery in Beverly Hills, who had found himself in a desperate financial situation before police were alerted to his potential involvement from a tip on America's Most Wanted, who ended up killing himself right in front of police before they had a chance to ask him one single question. Other than that, no information as to how that confrontation with Harold unfolded or how it was handled was ever revealed by the police department either. And then there are those who question the ability of the Beverly Hills Police Department to properly investigate homicides in general. It takes a great deal of experience to become an effective homicide investigator, and I've mentioned this particular police department has had very few homicides in their city to investigate. In the 5 years leading up to Ronnie's murder, Beverly Hills saw only 5 homicides. All of them had been solved, and 2 of them were relatively easy domestic killings where one spouse killed the other spouse inside the home. Sometimes when small towns have murders, they turn to more experienced police departments for assistance. But some don't. And there is no indication that the Beverly Hills PD ever reached out to anyone to help with this investigation either. And to me, and this is my opinion, the inexperience became quite evident when the department first announced there was no ballistics match, and then they backtracked on that a couple days later and said on December 8, 2010, that the preliminary ballistics results from the Los Angeles County Firearms Crime Lab indicated a match between the weapon Harold used to kill himself and the weapon used to kill Ronnie, and they expected a complete match between the 2 weapons in a couple more weeks. They announced at the same time that Harold acted alone, and these declarations were made only 3 weeks after Ronnie's murder. But documents released later to the media related to the case indicated that all of these conclusions were made prior to have even looked into Ronnie's bank statements, prior to having looked into her computer hard drive, and prior to looking into her cell phone records. That stuff wasn't even examined until 4 months after Ronnie's death in March of 2011. So for the police department to have made that definitive of a statement without having first looked into these things that most police departments turn to in the first few days following a murder like this, the financial and electronic records of the victim to see who she was interacting with leading up to her death, leads us to believe that the Beverly Hills Police Department zeroed in on Harold Smith in the early stages of the investigation based on that anonymous America's Most Wanted tip, and likely only conducted a cursory investigation into other potential leads. Because once Harold shot himself to them, the case pretty much solved itself. When the crush of reporters began peppering the Beverly Hills Police Department at their press conference regarding means and motive with shades of skepticism, they stated, quote, "Through the interviews and the information that we have received, it leaves us to believe that Smith was at a desperate point in his life and was reaching out and doing desperate measures." They punctuated that statement with the belief that Smith was not a paid assassin. And before long, officials speaking to the media indicated that they've answered all the questions that they were going to answer, that the point of the press conference was to inform the media that the ballistics testing indicated a match, and that was that. And once they closed the case the following July, they had one more press conference to say that the investigation was exhaustive, and they've come to the definitive conclusion without a doubt that Harold Martin Smith was the sole perpetrator in the shooting of Ronni Chasen. End of story. But when the media investigators finally got a look at the case file on the investigation into Ronnie's death, the certainty that Harold was the person responsible for the crime was challenged by findings in the official reports. There isn't actually an absolute and conclusive ballistics match like the Beverly Hills PD had stated. The report actually came to an inconclusive finding that read that the fired bullet jacket could have been fired from Smith's gun, as they exhibited similar general rifling characteristics and some agreement of individual characteristics, but are insufficient for an identification. The ballistics examiner also noted that even though the fired bullet core is consistent with a .39 Special or a .357 Magnum caliber ammunition, it offered no comparison value. In other words, there was nothing forensically valuable enough to say that these bullets came from the same weapon. Yet, the Beverly Hills Police Department insists that the gun Harold killed himself with and the gun that killed Ronnie were one and the same. And there were more issues that arose in regards to the department's investigation into Ronnie's murder. For instance, there is nothing in the case file that showed Ronnie's car was ever thoroughly dusted for fingerprints. More alarming is the fact that the passenger side wasn't dusted for fingerprints at all, which is the side that Ronnie was shot from. What's more, Ronnie's purse was right there in the passenger seat. Harold was known to have tried to steal purses from women, so we know he knows what he's looking for, and it was right there for the taking. Why wouldn't he grab it once he blew out the passenger side window if robbery was his motive? When the new chief of police of Beverly Hills, Sandra Spagnoli, was questioned some years after Ronnie's killing for an article in Vogue magazine, she was asked 24 questions about her department's investigation into the murder, all of which she declined to answer. They asked about the questionable ballistics, potential surveillance footage that they may or may not have collected that placed Smith in and around the crime scene the night of the murder, and why some of the people who were close to Ronnie and those that were with her earlier in the evening prior to her death, why were they never sought for questioning? And remember, investigators were never able to speak to their suspect either because he killed himself in their presence before they ever had a chance to. In defending Chief Spagnoli, a spokesperson with the department echoed what they've been saying since July of 2011. This case is closed and there are no plans to ever reopen it. And as for the chief, she wasn't on the job at the time and she has no information and nothing further to add. And the Beverly Hills Police Department has refused to answer any questions regarding their collecting of evidence at the onset of the investigation and beyond. Experts in criminology, instructors in police science and criminal justice, experts in crime scene processing have all come to the unanimous conclusion that the BHPD's handling of the investigation and the evidence left much to be desired. And of the question as to the lack of surveillance footage placing Harold at the scene, a retired LAPD homicide detective and frequent expert witness when it comes to police policy and procedure said there has to be some security cameras in that neighborhood that would have caught him. I mean, Beverly Hills? Give me a break. You have a black man supposedly on a bike in the middle of the night? He'd have been stopped 15 times. He would have stood out like a sore thumb. And dreamers, in a side note, the current chief of police of Beverly Hills that I mentioned, who incidentally was the first woman to hold the position, Sandra Spagnoli, she came on the job in August of 2016. And ever since, she had found herself embroiled in all kinds of scandals within the department, including accusations of misconduct, instances of racism, having made anti-Semitic statements, denying certain individuals promotions while offering promotions to others that she'd been accused of being involved with sexually. And in the 2 years following her holding the position of chief of police, no less than 20 former and current employees with the department have either filed grievances within the department or have filed lawsuits against the city outlining the accusations against Spagnoli. And by the end of 2018, the first of those lawsuits was settled out of court to the tune of $2.3 million. Spagnoli categorically denied any wrongdoing, and the settlement was reached at the behest of the city's insurance carrier. Why would all of these current and former employees say these things about her? Well, to her, it is the result of people being resistant to change. She believed these employees became disgruntled after she took charge of the department and began implementing reforms, which included changes to the way her officers were disciplined, as well as the structure of command. And her predecessor, David Snowden, also retired amid a scandal of his own involving an agreement he entered into with a private security contractor hired by the Beverly Hills Unified School District. Not that this has any bearing on our story today. You can take this with a grain of salt, but it's just another aspect of the department and the people assigned to the duty of protecting and serving Beverly Hills and investigating crimes, serious or otherwise, when called upon to do so. And whenever the former chief is ever questioned about Ronnie's case, he gives the same auto response as everyone else. This is a robbery gone wrong, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing more to say about it. Ronni Chasen is remembered as a woman who was never afraid to tell anyone exactly what she thought. She was brassy, and her exuberant personality took her far and was seemingly boundless. She married once briefly but never had children, yet she dated some pretty influential men, including composer John Williams. At the time of her death, she was estimated to be worth approximately $6 million, and nearly all of it was left to her brother's daughter, a niece that she favored, Melissa Cohen. For reasons unknown, she left another one of her brother's daughters $10, with the will having stated, "I have intentionally and with full knowledge of the consequences omitted to providing for my niece, Jill Cohen, also known as Jill Gatsby, except for the gift of $10. And apparently elsewhere in the will, it said something along the lines of, "She knows what she did." I would so love to know what happened between them, and I tried looking it up, and I found this article on E! News Online with the headline, "Ronni Chasen's niece speaks out on being dissed in the will," and I was like, oh my God, cool, I can get this information. But her niece, Jill Gatsby, said, quote, "I loved my Aunt Ronni very much. She was my favorite aunt, and she was someone I admired in many ways. Everyone always said that we were so much alike and she could have been my mother. My dad always joked that I was her illegitimate daughter that he had raised in secret. As for the $10, that's a real family secret regarding Ronni and my career as a writer, which I am choosing to keep to myself at this time. My sister taught me forgiveness and love. She found a way to Ronnie's heart that no one else in our family ever could. Perhaps one day the whole truth will be told, but for now it's time to mourn and pray that whoever did this is brought to justice. All my best, Jill Gatsby." So, no, I don't know what happened between them and why she only left her $10. 6 years after Ronnie's murder and Harold's suicide, the America's Most Wanted tipster came forward and identified himself. The man who called in the tip was a gentleman by the name of Laramie Beckay, and the Hollywood Reporter described him as a disabled punk musician living on government assistance who lived in an apartment a few doors down from Harold on the 3rd floor of the Harvey Apartments. When asked why he decided to come forward, he said that he felt forgotten and he wanted the credit for his help in solving Ronnie's murder. He was slated to be involved in the documentary that had been in the works focusing on Ronnie's case, but ended up being at odds with the documentarian and was no longer going to be involved. And in speaking of Harold, as Laramie Beckay knew him, he said he was polite, a sensitive person, who he never witnessed use any drugs, nor did a foul word ever come out of his mouth. Lots of questions about this tipster, dreamers, lots of questions. I don't know what he really knew or what he heard or what he believed, but in my opinion, I know it doesn't take a rocket scientist to reach this conclusion, but it pretty much sounds like Laramie Beckay was motivated by the reward. And he wasn't even paid out immediately. He had to file a lawsuit, eventually being paid $100,000. The original $125,000 reward was offered by 2 individuals. Publicist Michael Levine, he pitched in $25,000, and Palm Springs Film Festival organizer Harold Matzner offered up $100,000. The suit was settled, and Matzner went on to pay the $100,000 out of his own pocket, grateful in the end that the case was solved. Anyway, it's further my opinion that Laramie Bacay took the money and remained anonymous, likely until he ran out of money. Then he decided to come forward in an effort to continue to capitalize more on his role in the case. He even said to himself that he felt forgotten and he wanted credit, which translates to me that he would like to earn more money, which is absolutely his right to do. If someone is willing to pay him for his story, but it doesn't really paint the best portrait of the guy, I mean, he's already been paid a large sum of money for his tip. Anything beyond that kind of sort of comes off as exploitative. Also, it brings into question his motives when it comes to calling in that tip in the first place. I mean, okay, if Harold was in fact the killer, then great. Justice was had, and America's Most Wanted did its job. But what if Laramie Bacay found the perfect storm in getting himself a once-in-a-lifetime chance at a big payday? There were these rumors going around the Harvey apartments. Harold was already an unstable guy. He could not have known this, but there was an inept police department investigating the case who were looking to quickly wrap this high-profile murder up so it would not become a blemish on their fancy department. Because I have no doubt that the Beverly Hills Police Department wanted to get this solved as quickly and quietly as possible, and I wouldn't put it past them to pin the crime on a poor, downtrodden guy like Harold. And it was just their luck that he killed himself, which only fed into the narrative that they wanted to spin. That's a lot of accusation and conjecture on my part, but it sounds very, very plausible. I also wouldn't be surprised if the falling out with the documentarian working on Ronnie's murder was over money as well. Anyway, Laramie admitted that he wasn't that close with Harold. They would share food that they got from the food bank. Harold told him that it was difficult for him to find employment because of his criminal record, which included that purse-snatching incident that took place on Doheny Drive in Beverly Hills, and a second incident which landed him that 11-year jail sentence. So he wasn't exactly the most upstanding citizen by any stretch of the imagination. According to Laramie, Harold spoke often of never having any money, not being able to find work, falling behind on his rent, and he spoke often of suicide. And Laramie said he contacted America's Most Wanted because his suspicions of Harold began to grow. 6 days after the murder, on November 22nd, Harold was evicted from his apartment. Following that, he asked Laramie if he could store a couple of boxes and a bag at his place, which he allowed him to do. From there, according to Laramie, Harold sporadically returned to the apartment, and on the night of Ronnie's murder, 90 minutes after she was shot and killed, so at approximately 2 a.m, Harold appeared at his front door asking if the police had been there. Had he seen anything on TV? And he followed that up with, "We did not have this conversation." Then the following morning, at around 11 a.m., Harold appeared at his door asking for $1 that he needed to retrieve his bike. Laramie asked him where it was, and he told him that it was in Beverly Hills. And according to Laramie Bacay, it was at that point he became convinced that Harold Smith was responsible for Ronni Chasen's murder. But the discrepancy in this story is Ronni Chasen's murder wasn't reported in the media until much later that evening. At the time that he said Harold appeared at his door asking for $1, Ronni Chasen's murder had not yet hit the airwaves. So anyway, he decided to wait 2 weeks before he called in his tip. He said he hesitated because Harold already had those 2 strikes, and they didn't ever even really talk about the murder. To Laramie, Harold was becoming unhinged and paranoid. A week after the murder, he supposedly told Laramie, "If I'm not back by Thursday, I'll be resting in peace." When police came to the apartment to follow up on the tip, Harold brandished his handgun, a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, and he shot himself in the head. His mountain bike was right next to him, and all of this happened in the lobby area of the Harvey apartments. The bullet, which entered his right temple and exited out the upper left side of his head, then ricocheted off a set of mailboxes, landing on the floor near his bike. Now, Harvey did not leave a suicide note behind in his apartment, but this very well could have been a spur-of-the-moment decision made in the face of police officers there to question him about his potential involvement in a murder. I still wonder how it was police approached him, and what prompted him to just go for the gun and end his life. I know police are approaching who they think is a murder suspect, but he apparently had enough time and opportunity to shoot himself, which could very well have been enough time and opportunity for him to shoot one of them too. So how cautiously were they approaching? What did they say? What sent Harold to that place? Police won't say. The gun was eventually determined to have been stolen 3 years earlier from the home of a retired LAPD officer. Was the ammunition stolen along with the gun? I could not find that information, but that could explain why Harold was in possession of those hollow point bullets. The lobby of the Harvey apartments was equipped with surveillance cameras, and multiple requests for that along with the other documents related to Harold's suicide have been made by the documentarian, but so far the BHPD has not provided these items. In his pockets, Harold was carrying some papers that indicated he had been actively looking for work and a place to live, including a flyer for a $100 a week place to stay in Hollywood that was close to public transportation. He also had papers with information for job leads, the phone number of a job coach, and a couple of leads for a warehouse job and a forklift job, which for me adds another layer of sadness to Harold's story. And all of this still leaves so many questions unanswered. Harold was what is termed as a snatch and grab criminal. His whole history had been just that. Why would he suddenly resort to such a violent surprise ambush? Why is the fact that Harold committed suicide been taken as analogous to guilt? Harold has been deemed guilty without the right of due process. He was never brought to face a trial. The facts were never made to stand up to the scrutiny of a grand jury. An indictment was never handed down by any prosecutor, and Harold was never given the opportunity to plead his case or defend himself in front of a jury of his peers. The Beverly Hills Police Department took it upon themselves, based on how they wanted to piece the facts together, to find Harold Smith guilty of murder. Their investigation was never subject to examination by anyone else but themselves. And this just isn't a country where we convict someone in the absence of due process. And that is exactly what the Beverly Hills Police Department has done here. There were no witnesses. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance, nothing that placed Harold Smith anywhere near the scene of the crime. The ballistics evidence is shaky at best, with the Beverly Hills Police Department having taken the report of the expert examiner that could have gone one way or the other and decided to swing it their way to favor and bolster their narrative. Is this beyond a reasonable doubt just because the Beverly Hills Police Department says so? Imagine this being presented at trial. Even a mediocre public defender could punch holes in the evidence as weak and unreliable as this. But I do think Harold Smith knew one very important thing. His word, no matter what he said, no matter how much he insisted he was innocent, would not have been enough for him to see his way out of this in a court of law. He knew, being an African American man with an extensive criminal history, including a robbery in Beverly Hills, with mental instability in his background, charged with killing a wealthy white woman, he wouldn't make it out. Even if he was innocent, he knew and understood the cards were stacked against him. And so, he chose to exit this world on his own terms. Nobody, myself included, really knows for sure if Harold Smith is innocent or not. But nobody feels as though his guilt has been aptly proven, except for the Beverly Hills Police Department. And that brings this 89th episode of California Dreaming to a close. If you would like to discuss this case in more detail or any of the others that we have covered, please feel free to request and join the California Dreaming official Facebook discussion page. There we have cultivated an amazing community of listeners and true crime fans who share their thoughts and opinions on all of our cases that we cover, as well as current true crime stories, other news events, particularly Florida man stories apparently, TV shows that we enjoy, documentaries that we've watched, books that we've read. Whatever you find that you would like to share, please come and join us. You can also follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at California Dreaming Pod. And California Dreaming is proudly brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a podcast production company located in Los Angeles, California, with a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to consistently improve upon our current roster of shows, to develop content that appeals to people all over the world, and to provide a thriving community for listeners and podcasters alike. I am very proud to be a part of an amazing group of shows and hosts. So please visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You can also find links to all of our shows, our merchandise store where you can find California Dreaming merch, get your t-shirt or your mug or whatever and post it in our group or on Instagram for everybody to see. Or if you just want to email us and let us know what you think, give us your feedback, your comments, your questions, anything you want. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much again for listening. I am your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams.